Did you know that as you stay in the position or the measure that God has given you, you know what happens? You begin to reach people, but then your measure begins to grow. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is talking about here in 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter. We talked yesterday about verse number 15. I want to encourage you to go back and listen to yesterday's podcast to get the whole context, the whole gist, if I could use that word, of what the Apostle Paul is saying. Now, in verse number 16, he says, so as to preach the gospel even to the regions beyond you. What's Paul saying? He's saying because we were faithful to stay within our measure, to stay within what God had appointed us to do for you, Corinthians, because we started the church in Corinth, God is increasing our measure. He's increasing it, and he says here, so as to preach the gospel even to the regions beyond you. Paul, even though Paul realizes his measure, he still has in his sight, in his vision, regions beyond. He still has in his vision going beyond and further and further and further and further. You know what? You stay in your measure, I'll stay in my measure, but you know what? We need to constantly be looking forward, knowing that as we are faithful in our measure, God is going to move us to different places. He's going to increase our measure. He's going to move us further and further in our ministries. And so Paul says, so as to preach the gospel even to the regions beyond you. And then continuing on in verse number 16, and not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another. What's Paul saying? He's saying we're moving on. We're going to move on into different regions, into different areas of the world. Now, let me just say this. We need to understand something here. Paul has a vision to go to the unreached churches. That's Paul's desire, to go not to the unreached churches, unreached cities. That's Paul's desire. And so he says not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another. Paul's saying, I'm not gonna brag about what I did in someone else's sphere, what I did in someone else's area. I am going to move on beyond. I am going to continue to move on. So listen to me. Hear this. Even though you have a sphere, always be looking outside your sphere. Because as you're faithful in the sphere or the measure that God has given you, God is going to move you on into different places and increase you. Now, moving on to verse number 17. And this is what Paul wrote. But he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. The Apostle Paul here is quoting. And he's saying, you know what, if you're going to boast, make sure that you're boasting in God. Make sure that you're boasting about what God has done. Now, God is the one that provides the measure. God is the one that provides the power. God is the one that provides the resources. Paul is saying, you know what, if you're going to boast, boast in the Lord. Boast in what God has done. Don't boast and say, oh, look what I've done. Look what I've done. Look what I've accomplished in my life. No, Paul is saying, you know what? If you're going to boast, boast in what God has done. Boast in the Lord. Boast in saying, you know what? I was once a sinner. I was once opposed to Christianity. I was once a man who killed Christians. Now, look what God has done. That's what Paul is saying. He's saying, for he who boasts is to boast in the Lord. You know what? It's good to boast in the Lord. It's good to say, look what the Lord has done. He healed my body. There's an old song, I think it's an old Pentecostal song. He healed my body. He saved my soul. And they just go on and talk about all the things that the Lord has done. So if you're going to boast in the fact that you're just doing what the Lord has given you to do. Boast in the fact that it's not your strength, it's not your ability, but it's those divinely powerful weapons that are pulling down strongholds, not only in your life, but in the lives of other people. It's the Word of God working through you in the lives of other people. If you're going to boast in the Lord. And then verse number 18. For it is not he who commends himself that is approved. You know what? If you're a person and you're constantly commending yourself. Now, commends means to set in place. If you're constantly putting yourself up. And by the way, let me just say this. I have seen this over and over and over. Next year, I will be, I believe, 50 years in full-time ministry. And I've seen things happen. And I've seen people commend themselves and set themselves up. I am the apostle. I am the priest. I am. And they never boast in what God has done. They are boasting in what they have done. And so Paul writes this, for it is not he who commends himself that is approved. If you're constantly having to put yourself in a place, in a seat of authority, or in a place or in a position, and I see this all the time. I see this in churches. People come into churches and they're constantly struggling to get that position. You know, back in my childhood, if you had to sit up in the front of church, it usually meant you came late for the service, because in the churches that I went to, we filled the back pews first and then moved forward. Nowadays, it's almost the opposite, especially in the charismatic Pentecostal circles. You got to sit up front. You got to be up front. You got to show. And what are you doing? You're commending yourselves. And Paul says that he who commends himself, it's not approved. In other words, God does not put his stamp of approval on people like that, but he says, but he whom the Lord commends. He whom the Lord shows that they are operating in my will. He who the Lord commends. He who the Lord places in positions. That's who the Lord approves. My prayer for you as we close out this podcast is that you would be a person that's constantly looking for the position that God has for you, because in that position you will find the approval of God. Thank you for watching. Join us again tomorrow.